The idea of capturing fishers' observations and knowledge. I learnt a term.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Sure, yep.
Very frustrating.
Can you hear me? Could everybody hear back of the room? Good, okay. So, learnt a new word when I started this, experiential. It just means basically what people know. And it's been, as I say, something of a holy grail to try and extract information from fishermen and get them to volunteer information that may be useful. An isolated observation can potentially mean nothing. An aggregated observation that's validated and quality controlled can actually be very important. It's hard data. It can be useful. It can be useful to individual fishermen, and it can also be useful in management and planning purposes. That statement was written by Robert Johannes in 1981, and he was something of a legend in this field, worked a great deal in the Pacific, and he made this observation that there are basically very few marine biologists who know actually very little about the sea, but there are lots of fishermen who spent many generations working at sea, and they have massive amounts of accumulated knowledge. And we're beginning to draw on that already, just in terms of observations on the back of a vessel. The fact that we think we can measure the difference between a male and a female crab based on the shape of the carapace leads us to new ways of measuring it. So therefore we do not have to find necessarily a method for turning that crab up the other way and looking at it and finding a computer program that will tell us whether it's male or female. We may simply be able to do that by a subtle shape change in the carapace. And that's knowledge that we've derived from the fishermen. So there's lots of information out there that fishermen can give us that we think can inform some of these management processes. There are also lots of new technologies out there which make it much easier to capture that information. So there are apps, there are all sorts of things we can design very quickly. Again, lots of open source software where if we can find the right way to engage fishermen and they are happy to provide us with information, we can start to bring it together in ways that we think might be useful to us. So, the objectives: define fisher-derived data, that's observations and knowledge, and try and categorise that. Identify a quality-assured system. So in other words, how can we make sure that the information that we're getting is of a certain value to us, and can we quantify that value? We also want to investigate methods to encourage that sort of reporting. You know, what would make it easy for somebody to report? Are they using Twitter? Are they using other forms of social media? Are there any processes or systems or natural processes and systems that fishermen are engaged in which would lend that activity to providing us with the information we think might be useful? We also want to look at it in terms of interactions with vulnerable species. Obviously, as fishermen fish using creels, there is a potential for interaction with things like seabirds, cetaceans, seals, basking sharks. We have very little information on whether those are negative or positive interactions, and that leads to questions in the media and questions in terms of conservation that we still don't have the data to answer. We also want to try and develop from that information risk-based models. So in other words, are there any hotspots around the coast at given times of the year when we would recommend, for example, that you might want to reduce fishing effort, or indeed areas which have been no-go areas, which we can say, well, actually, it's not a problem. You can fish there quite easily without any potential interaction with some of these sensitive species. So the important thing is we require input from fishermen, and that's about their day-to-day experiences, and that means that we will be conducting surveys on vessels and trying to talk to fishermen about the sorts of information they log on a daily basis. They probably don't necessarily think about it as being important, but once we start to categorise that data, once we start to formalise the way we capture it, we might be able to extract useful knowledge from that. We also want to be able to show how that categorised data can be used in decision making. So, for example, I'm interested in terms of interpretation of vessel tracks to know why a fisherman goes fishing on any particular day in a particular location. And everybody will tell you a different story. The wind was from one direction, it's of a given strength, we fish over there. If the tide is running in that direction, the wind's in that direction, we only fish over there. So there are these rules, metrics by which fishermen work, their local knowledge, and that can help us interpret the sort of data, the sort of spatial data that we're beginning to collect through other work packages. So this brings us on to quality assured. What do we mean by quality assured? Well, there are various ways that we might be able to do that. So could we make them independently verified observations? So it's just two independent fishermen giving us the same information within approximately the same time frame. Could we actually get vessels to record that information using mobile telephones or other systems and processes that they may have to hand, which would allow them to record that experiential data and us to be able to log it in a way that's useful to us. Again, an observation made by one fisherman in one region, if we don't see that duplicated around the shore, we may not know it's important, but if we've got all those fishermen within a given region recording that sort of information, it will quickly show up as something that may be important. So, for example, if you are pulling up crabs that are showing a particular disease, if there's an area where you know there may be a problem in terms of soft shells or animals that are coming up that are buried, again, this is useful information that feeds into fishing practice and may help to optimise the way that people fish so they don't waste time and energy. So the whole idea is that we want to develop this hierarchy of quality assurance and make sure that it works and make sure that we can actually deliver something that's useful from that conversation. We also want to facilitate voluntary reporting. Somebody may not want to tell you that their creels were taken or tangled with a basking shark. Again, it's one of those things, well, does it, I mean, it sounds like an awful thing, but at the end of the day, does it actually matter? I mean, it's probably heresy. I come from Sea Mammal Research Unit at St Andrews, and that's a picture of where we've had sightings of whales around the coast of Scotland since 1992 through to 2016, and a few of the dots on there register entanglements. Well, overall, okay, it may represent to some people an animal welfare issue, but overall, if it's not having an impact on the population, it may mean that it's nothing for us to actually worry about. So this sort of information can actually be useful to us as well. So ultimately, we want to categorise the information, we want to try and identify methods for voluntary reporting, and then we want to be able to see how we can feed that data into some of these decision-making processes. And that may happen in a number of different ways at a number of different levels. But without the data there, and without having some sort of quality control attached to it, we're missing a huge amount of experiential data that's captured by fishermen on a day-to-day basis. I can have a conversation with colleagues at St Andrews who work in the harbour there, and I learn something new every single time I either go on a vessel or I talk to them, because they've been doing it for such a long time. And they may not know that the information they're conveying is actually very important, perhaps in a biological context, but also in a way that we might be able to then interpret things like soak times, catch per unit effort, and how that might feed into improving a business model so that you can improve your efficiency.